G20 leaders met this week in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with a lot on the discussion agenda: climate change, ongoing wars, and the eradication of poverty and hunger. How have they fared? What's in it for the world and Africa especially? And as South Africa gears up for its presidency, what is the vision likely to be? We talk about it with Mikatekiso Kubayi, senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with UNISA, and research fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thought, and Dr Kingsley Makhubela, risk analyst and former diplomat. Thank you both for your time this morning. Really do appreciate it. And Mikatekiso, maybe we start with you. I know if I ask you the question, what have been your standouts, you can go from Africa, you can go to global wars, and there are a range of different things. It may be three top things that you thought were markedly different from commitments the G20 has made in its previous cycle.
Thank you, Imam. The first thing that I see is at the very beginning of the declaration of the heads of state of government, heads of state and government is an acceptance, that inequalities, is at the root, of, many of the global challenges that we face today. So immediately you begin, if you start with, that acknowledgement, you pave a way to then ask what is therefore to be done, about, these inequalities that are causing so many problems. Brazil has proposed, a global coalition against hunger and poverty, and so on. Brazil has also made numerous proposals on the reform of multilateral development banks or the global financial architecture broadly. So if you begin from a point of departure that says that there is this particular problem of inequalities that is causing all of these problems, then you begin to expect that you will be deliberating over these issues, that structural issues that are causing it. I think that is a fantastic way. Brazil has done a fantastic job to arrive at this particular point.
Well, Kingsley, let me pick up that particular theme with you. So on the issue of effective taxation of the super rich, they met here to agree on a global tax on the world's 3,300 richest individuals, which could raise up to $250 billion. But here's the backdrop that was painted by Oxfam, that the top 1% in the G20 countries now account for 31% of total wealth. And this is up from a quarter to 26% 2 decades ago. And there was some opposition on this item. There was an idea to create a database of income and assets of individuals considered internationally to be ultra-rich. But over half of the world's poorest people live in G20 countries. And we talk about the issue of inequality over and over every year, not only here, but in Davos and other places where these types of conversations are held. Is this going to do anything to breach inequality gaps? Is this a credible statement?
Good morning, Iman. I think the Brazilians have done a fantastic job. I agree with Mikatekiso. To really start to drill down inequality and speak about food security. If you look at people who are going hungry around the world, 733 million people, they go without food. And the large part of this, it's here in the continent. 1 out of every 5 people in Africa, they go to bed without food. Now, the Brazilian came up with this idea to tax the super rich, to be able to fund some of the social inequalities that we see. Of course, it was quite clear from the beginning, Imani, that the rich are going to resist this. Remember, the rich have been playing a critical role in funding political parties. So you're unlikely to get that to happen. Not only Elon Musk in this country, elections also are funded by rich people who will be very reluctant to see and to pay this amount of tax. Of course, they're going to raise questions around wastages in government, corruption in government, but it's to create the wealth base to be able to attend to those issues. And given the fact that you are having, Iman, about 317 trillion actually, of debt around the world, you're unlikely to attend to the development goals that they've set themselves up, the heads of state.
Yeah, and these are really sobering. When we look at these numbers, we see the gap and the ground that has to be traversed to make a credible dent in how we deal with inequality and how we look at rich countries and the massive inequality that exists in those countries. I'm so tempted to talk more about some of the other issues that dominated conversations there. We think about calls for a truce or a ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine. And if time allows, we'll circle back to that. But Mikatekiso, your organization, the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, is part of a trio, including the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with UNISA, of which you're also a part, and the South African Institute of International Affairs, to coordinate what's called Think 20 South Africa. And they're going to play a massive role in shaping an official engagement group of the G20 during our presidency, which kicks off later this year to November next year. Talk to us about how you're planning to shape likely policy recommendations to the G20 in the next cycle.
Well, thank you for that, Iman. Yes, it is true. DECO put us together as a team, SAIA, IGD, and the Institute for Pan-African Thought to organize Think 20 South Africa 2025. Think 20 now is what is an ideas bank, for the G20, right? It's an ideas bank. So how it actually works is you have task forces, right? Where organized according to particular themes, maybe say digital transformation, or be it strengthening multilateralism or global governance, and so on, right? You can have 6, you can have 7, you can have 10, and so on. But I think South Africa is going to have about 5, and there are reasons for that as well. What happens in these task forces is you have researchers from across the globe, experts, seasoned, highly regarded experts in their field, coming to, deliberate, over these themes, make proposals, write policy briefs, right? And these policy briefs are then fed to the various tracks, Sherpa tracks, ministerial tracks, the various dialogue, groups, and so on of the G20. So the G20 has got several, engagement groups. So the G20 isn't just the one summit at the end of the year. No, it starts literally on the 1st of December. South Africa takes over. The G20 already starts, right? We essentially would be launching our T20 then, and there would be a series of meetings throughout, between that point, and the point that we, hand over again at the end of November to the United States. So multiple tracks, ministers, of various, topical or thematic areas, will be engaging. And depending also on what South Africa decides, for instance, the issue of inequality, will now also be, a standalone, issue that will be driven, fairly, significantly by South Africa. As something that I hope will become a permanent a standing discussion point, a standing working group theme going forward. But essentially, Iman, that's how it works. So you have researchers from around the world that come together, they brainstorm, they think, they research, and they make proposals, on the various thematic areas as per the priorities of the presiding country. At particular point,
And Kingsley, I know that you probably get this question, and maybe it irritates you a little bit because people like myself who aren't experts try to simplify things. So we're taking up the presidency. You've heard some of the priorities that Mikatekiso is sharing with us around what could, how we would shape and influence those discussions. But we've got to bring it back to what's in it for individual countries, for example. And you think about South Africa, I think our Gini coefficient, which talks about our inequality, is at last count, I think it was around 0.67. Please correct me if that number is slightly outdated. We'd be asking, well, what really is in it for us? We're dealing with the very basics of, economic issues related to inflation, high cost of living. We're talking about people going to bed hungry in South Africa. So how does this all become real and meaningful, our presidency of the G20?
Imani, if you look at the leaders' declaration coming out of Rio, there are 2 omissions in my own view. One, they speak about the conflict and wars, and they then pivot to national positions. That in diplomacy, it simply means that there's no consensus. People will rely on their individual positions. But worst part of it is that there's no mention of these conflicts that are raging in the continent, be it the Sudan conflict in the Sahel. There's no mention of this conflict, no reference. The only two conflicts that are featuring predominantly, and rightfully so, is a conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. I think South Africa would have to look into taking this moving forward, given the fact that South Africa has a policy position on the consolidation of the African agenda. Then coming back to the question of food security and the level of poverty and the discrepancies that we're seeing in the country, you see opulence, you see abject poverty, and we are unable to track this. We're unable to create jobs to absorb these people into working. There are certain things that are coming up. I mean, we need to focus. I see in the statement they expect South Africa to take over the question around the digital economy. But at the root of that digital economy is the artificial intelligence and the adverse consequences of artificial intelligence and the advantages. I don't know if South Africa has institutional capacity to start really channeling these issues and moving forward. Because once you channel this digital economy, you are likely to create more jobs, you're likely to make a bigger dent in terms of poverty and so on. But again, it's access to market once you've done that. So the question of the free trade agreement or that exists with different groups and access to certain markets and dealing with artificial barriers that are created for products from developing countries is one of the issues that South Africa needs to deal with head on.
So, Mikatekiso, maybe to bring it back to you then on these points about creating the institutional capacity to make whatever declarations, whatever is declared and commitments that are made real in an African context. Someone was making, one of the experts we had on earlier was making the point about the equivalencies between the EU and the African Union, for example, where one has teeth, one doesn't. One negotiates on behalf of a number of countries and one doesn't have the mandate to do so. And yet they both belong to this organization. And Kingsley is talking about the instability we've seen in the Sahel, where there has been a direct challenge to what we call democratic governance. They're redefining how they want to live and what they want to be a part of and not, leaving ECOWAS, for example, and looking to Russia in places like Burkina Faso. So is the G20, I mean, it's not meant to solve everything. It's not meant to do everything. So what is its greatest impact for the African continent in this particular formation then?
Oh, sorry.
Is it okay? Go ahead. Okay. Thank you, Iman, for that. You will recall that when G20 was first established in 1999, it was essentially a meeting of heads of government, heads of reserve banks, central banks, and ministers of finance, at the time. So when they were to coordinate of the major economies, to coordinate policy, to undergird cooperation as for the stability of the global economy. Now, in 2008, when the financial crisis hit, right, then President George Bush, decided that no, look, this has to be elevated to summit level. Of course, there are also, other reasons, why that occurred. It's another discussion, but it, was elevated to summit level of heads of state and government, right? But since then, it has, evolved to also include other issues beyond just, purely finance, and coordinating the global economy. For instance, issues such as global security, has started to also feature, right? Issues, as other issues, social issues, political issues, that are non-core, or at least non-core original mandate, of the G20 are starting to feature, quite prominently at G20 summits. However, the big issues right now that, are dominating discourse that are so crucial, for the aspirations of particularly Africa and the global South, development. And for that, you require, massive amounts of financing, right, for infrastructure. Investment, in manufacturing, investment in tech startups. And by the way, you were talking about, the digital, age right now. investment in tech startups in Africa has declined, over the last year, or so, and that is something that, has to be looked at. So we need massive investment in logistics infrastructure. We need massive investments, in manufacturing, industry. Basically, we have to industrialize so that we can also take advantage of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and so on, build regional value chains, access global value chains, and so on. We have a big market, and even bigger potential market of 2.5 billion people by 2050, right? That's something quite significant, and the G20 can therefore help, in the main, from where I'm sitting, in achieving, in driving, implementing, these, desired and agreed to reforms of, multilateral, of the global financial architecture, so that all of these funds can, then be easier accessible, right, by the global South, and Africa, in particular. Another point quickly to make.
I've got to leave it there, though. I've got to leave it there, though, Mikatekiso, just for a moment, because we have some commitments in terms of our broadcasting commitments. But I would love to have both of you back, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela as well, because I know that you would want to come back in and make some concluding remarks. The conversation doesn't end because we're gearing up to December when we do take over the presidency. And so these conversations are still going to be so relevant. Thank you so much for sharing the perspectives that you did today and for availing your time. We'll definitely have you back here at Newzroom Afrika.